Welcome to everyone, and of course to our panel of guests, Lian Sim, Yuki, and of course Dennis, whom you've heard for the last half an hour giving his take on conflicts of interest and how to manage them. As Pauline said, we do have a number of questions coming in. I can see 22 on the count already, so we're going to spend the most part of the rest of the session trying to answer some of these questions, but I think Dennis has already got a few of those things in his presentation. But nevertheless, we want to take this opportunity to hear from Lian Sim and of course Yuki as well. So folks, thank you so much for your time. Maybe one of the key questions that's coming up on the screen now is really this whole idea about COVID, how it's changing the whole environment as we know it in business, individuals, our personal lives, and no doubt for charities as well. So maybe, have Lian Sim and Yuki come in first. How do you think COVID-19 is going to change the whole management of conflicts of interest? Maybe we'll start with the lady. So Lian Sim, you go first.
Thank you, Melvin. One of the things that COVID has made us do is to work remotely. So we don't see each other so much, and we work from home, we work at a distance, we use communications, and we use technology. This does raise some risks in that we don't see each other, we can't touch and feel, but on the other hand, there are some compensations. And what it does allow is a traceable route of communications. So if you need to have things approved, you may not be able to fill in an actual form as you did before, but you can certainly do something about it on email or through messages. These are trackable, these are storable, and they could be as good as what you had before. So I think we shouldn't look on ourselves as being disadvantaged, but just that it's a different system and it will offer opportunities to actually perhaps advance and keep that same level of safety. I'll leave some more things for Prof.
Yeah, indeed. Good segue to Prof. Yuki, what do you think?
Right. I think in terms of, I think what Nancy said is correct. In that sense, the lack of face-to-face actually cut us off from one possible source of contact in which we're able to discern from body language for in physical meetings concerning possibility of conflict of interest. But it has also given us additional compensation because right now everything moves online. When you move online and when you're in doubt, you actually do a lot more search. Right? You Google the company, you look at who are the directors, who are the owners, and look at the relationship and so on and so forth. So in that sense, that company will have to continue to be vigilant, right? They have to compensate what is lacking physical contact with virtual contact, right? And I think we can compensate that going forward.
Yeah, Dennis, come on in on this. I mean, obviously you've shared some views there, but this whole idea about, people not seeing each other because you've got to work from anywhere, working remotely. How do you see, the impact on COVID-19 really when you talk to your clients and talk to people that you consult for, how do they manage those COI issues?
I think agree fully with, Prof as well as Lian Sim. Is obviously this environment has created a lot more constraints for us, right? But there are certain things which you can still do physically, right? I mean, the due diligence can always be done. Background checks you have a lot, right? In fact, there's obviously a lot of background checks that have been done on certain corporates in the last couple of weeks, right? We all know that, those who like to buy football clubs, but with that, I mean, you can just imagine, the power of those searches. I mean, the ability of them to find out where the relationships lie are there, right? These are obviously very sophisticated tools that people use, right? It may not be available to the nonprofit, right? But when it comes to in terms of making that decision, right? I had a lot of examples earlier on the 3 case studies. What were the situations, and how could these conflicts have been further escalated? And even if there was a potential conflict, right, when somebody actually recruits themselves, how then does the remaining committee then make an objective and proper assessment? We also have, the easing of the safe distancing rules and so forth coming on board on 28th of September. I think more and more companies will start to come online, but of course you have to take note of, the number of people involved in those physical discussions. I think can still happen. And it will be probably happening at levels which involve, the decision-making committee, right? So I think ultimately a mix of both, you would have, a lot of due diligence done with further depth. And of course, we need to we need to apply it in relevance to the size of the spend we're talking about, right? You're going to talk about big tenders, big projects, you know, in complex programs. You know, you can still do a lot of due diligence online, all right, and those searches, but you, I think, need to have the comfort, right? And that nothing beats a physical face-to-face.
So on that note, just following up on what you just said, Dennis, I know you talked about contractual value, whether, you know, when you deal with tenders, there's a certain contract value to it, but is the money amount really the issue here, or do conflicts of interest actually cut across, no matter whether it's $1 or $1 million?
No, I think it actually cut across, right? It really depends, because you can have a direct commercial benefit, right? In which case it's a glaring conflict of interest, right? Or you can also be someone with a vested interest, right? Or deemed interest, right? In such situations, I think the reputation of the person also calls into play, right? If you look at board members, a lot of the board members actually are volunteers, and they're good-hearted people, right? And to them, they actually want to do good. So it is nothing to do with how much an entity out there earns if it's associated with him. It's more in terms of, if I know that somebody can do the job for you, right, and he's the best person to do for you, I will recommend. And that recommendation bears a lot of weight, right? So I think it's more the reputation part, right? And these are things which I think board members all agree, right? It's not just about the financial gains. Many of them are here. It's not that they are desperate for these little advisory amounts or the remuneration, right? It's because they want to do good to help. But in doing so, they actually, you know, the framework or the situation itself didn't call for them to consider certain things, or maybe the organization didn't consider certain impact, right? And then it comes back and hurts them. So I think that there's something we got to take into consideration.
Okay, Lian Sim, come on in on this. Where do you stand in this debate?
I think that, well, there are various things one can talk about. One of them is the board members and volunteers. Volunteers come in and they give their time and their efforts as board members because they're keen that the charity advance and do well and bring benefits to the beneficiaries. They're not there for their own benefit. They're there because they want to benefit the charity. So an optimal decision is important to that board member. I think what they need to be aware of is that any transaction can be viewed from many points of view, and you want to have a good decision and a good outcome, the best outcome, so therefore the best choice among alternatives for the charity. At the same time, the way the decision is being made, or the processes and the care in investigating and looking at alternatives is important, because it also benefits the charity and the charity's reputation, and it builds that, as it were, the quality and the standing of the charity. So that too is of interest both to the charity and to the board member. The board member themselves have reputations to secure and to defend, so they too don't wish to be seen to be doing something that's not in the best interests of the charity, or of maintaining standards that they themselves would be associated with. So I think awareness is very important. That awareness should be there, looked at from various points of view, and disclosed at the very start, so that the proper processes can be taken. If it's viewed as something that protects all interests, why not? I don't think anyone would disagree with it. Sometimes if that has not yet been done, perhaps then the clarity is not there, and then there could be a disagreement. But I believe that if we look at it objectively and right at the outset, then we can establish what is needful and then go ahead with confidence.
Indeed. Okay, bring Yuki now in. I know, Prof, you've been answering a question in the Q&A in terms of text, but I just want to bring you into the picture about that whole conflict of interest management. And we've been talking about how, you know, the dollar value is not really that important, although it is something to be looking at in a big way. But at the same time, it's about, you know, the roles of the board members and also the role of management. How do they bring the two together such that these COIs, the conflicts of interests, are managed in the right way?
Yeah, right. What I want to do is I want to have a plea with the people who are attending this conference, they are the board members and the management. I think I always have to say, for the board members, gone are the days where we lend our name to a charity and then along the way, we bring glory to our name. Today, I think as a board member, it's a significant responsibility. See, I think the management need to understand when the board member serves on the charity, we hope that they serve with a pure heart, sincere interest, and they bring with them their entire reputation. So my plea always with the management, please protect the reputation of your board members, right? They come on board to serve. You really need to guard them. Don't put them in a situation where they lose face. Alternatively, their career, their whole life achievement is ruined because of irregularities. Right. So I think this is what I always ask, plead with management too. Of course, I think management also has to be courageous. Right? And I think board members, this is for you too. You should never put your management into difficulties, right? You may, out of the kindness of heart, introduce vendors or introduce some lobangs. Right? You need to understand that your management finds hard to reject you, right? You see, we are Asian society. I think let's be fair as it is. As an Asian society, we don't seek confrontation much, right? And generally, management or workers are workers. They don't want to challenge their bosses, right? So I think both parts must understand this conflict of interest is actually a lot more problematic in Asian charity, much more than Western charity, if I may take this position. Because you see, in the Asian charity, you see, we are non-confrontational. Right, we protect each other's face as it is, right, and we generally don't challenge orders, right? Is that So it puts us in a much more complicated dynamics arising from our Asian culture. So this is my personal view.
Yeah. So you brought up an interesting point of view, Prof, about that whole cultural aspect to it. And of course, you said about Asian culture, how face is very important. I just want to hear Lian Sim and Dennis, what are your thoughts on that in terms of whether there's a cultural difference in terms of how you manage COI issues, or is that, or is this supposed to be, absolutely above board based on the rules alone?
I think the importance of managing the COI is there no matter what the culture. I'm not an expert on charities outside Singapore. I don't really know, but I would say that each organization also has its own culture, and the way to do things and the way to bring things up, the way to introduce ideas, perhaps. So it's real. It's not trivial, and one wants to appreciate the directors who give their time and their effort and their their thought to the work. So one suggestion would be that to have to treat the matter as a process rather than anything that has personal, less of the personal and more of the process. So if there is a regular channel or a regular occasion where issues like this are brought up and surfaced and talked about, then I think that might help the whole group, as it were, the organization, to be aware and to determine how it's comfortable for them to deal with it. And then over time, it develops.
Yeah, so almost an arm's length process in trying to deal with a particular situation. Dennis, what are your thoughts?
Fully agree. I think the code, right, as a best practice also sets a benchmark in terms of where all our IPCs or non-profits need to move towards. Singapore today, right, yes, you can argue that there are certain charities or non-profits that are very steep in the Asian style, right? And there are some who are more Western because, through the dynamics or the mix of the board, also through the program partners that they deal with, right? Some of them are, you get a lot of external projects, and then partnerships. So I think it's a question of maybe how do we move there progressively. And I would like to think over the last couple of years, right, with all these issues being brought into light, and the scrutiny on conflicts of interest, right, and the impact of conflicts of interest on those who have deliberately breached them and those who have inadvertently caused difficulty for themselves, right, by not being aware of such scenarios, has made everybody a lot more aware that it's not about whether or not you find it embarrassing, but it's about whether or not we are doing what's right and what is the best thing to do for our organization. So I think we're moving as as a society and as a whole sector, in the right direction. And I think the code very much supports that, by having this baseline to say that, okay, this is where we want to be. And I think Singapore nonprofits, this is where we should go, right?
Yep. So quite a lot of process involved in that, and quite a lot of, I guess, rules that are given by the code, so to speak. I'm going to try and address a couple of the questions that are in the Q&A right now. And I know that people are voting, so the order is going to change, but I'll try to sort of stick to the order if I can. But one of the questions from Catherine here is really about, we talked about process. So during the work process involving the charities, for example, they may come up and do many projects together. And in the process, of course, establish personal or even friendly relationships with vendors who are contracted to do that work, such that you become friends, which is probably quite natural as you work with people in the different parts of your professional interactions. Is there a conflict of interest here in your view? Who would like to go for this one? Maybe Prof, come in and...
Yeah, I will basically respond in this manner. I think we have to go back to the operational definition of conflict of interest. I really like what Danny said. You see, the conflict of interest is where our interest in a transaction or arrangement affects our judgment, right? You see, it's not possible for us not to have relationship. All of us have relationship. But then the key question is that whether that relationship affects my judgment in terms of, one, it's okay to pay more. I accept a lower quality of goods. But the most important qualification is that in so making the judgment, do you disadvantage your charities? And if it does, then that relationship actually poses a conflict of interest. However, this is internal. It's a lot more difficult to basically measure it externally, right? So, but that is the reason why there are certain relationships where by thought patterns, they immediately induce what we so-called conflict of interest, like parental relationship, family relationships. Yes, I'm saying. So you can think of relationship as an entire spectrum, right? Which embed family all the way to casual, so-called social relationship. You see, right? This is how I would tackle it. Does that affect your judgment?
Okay, Lian Sim, what do you reckon?
I suppose what the questioner means is that because of friendly relationships, the ease of having got used to working with each other, they would prefer that this vendor gets the contract or does the business. I think that if the vendor continues to provide that quality and you have a process and the vendor is the resultant choice after the process, then it's very clear. If not, then what giving that contract to that vendor means that you're accepting a poorer quality for your charity just because you like working with that person. And I think it's not so much a conflict but of interest, but it's more whether you are doing your job well enough. It's a conflict of some sort, but it's more your own choices that you make, and should you be making that choice? I think that's for those reasons we have good processes to, as it were, test out whether the quality is really there, and use that. So it's for you to help you to use the process to test out the quality. And if you find that the test doesn't accord with your own feeling or instinct, then you should look at it, review it. Maybe the supplier needs to be pulled up a bit, it's getting a bit, slipshod or something like that. Give him a word, relook at the whole thing. Maybe you will get what you like, and maybe you won't. And if you don't, then you should do the right thing and make the right choice for the charity.
Yeah, indeed, and also to serve in the best interest of the charity. I would assume that that's a subtext of what you're saying there. Dennis,
you.
come on into this picture, but I guess I will also, so it's back to that whole issue about, building friendly relationships and how do you use that relationship to continue to serve the interests of the charity involved. But I will overlay this with a question from Jacqueline now, where you talked about, other than just the friendly relationships that you have, what if it's actually something that the donor is insisting on? So you have a donor, and Jacqueline is talking about this. Is there going to be a conflict of interest if a donor would specify the vendor that the charity should be working with, even though the charity does not have a business relationship with this vendor? Is that going to be a conflict, or is that going to be an opportunity to end up with something even better?
Yeah, so that's where actually I just wanted to fully agree with all the viewpoints shared by Lian Sim and by Prof. I think the concept of this friendship thing also can cut both ways. You may have friendships, right, which are forged because there has been good positive experiences in the past, right, that have led to that particular point in time where the friendship is strong, right, and those friendships can actually help to further ensure, right, that those companies actually go beyond what is needed in order to deliver the quality and to deliver the final outcome to the non-profit. Right? I mean, we've seen situations like that whereby, because it's reputation at stake, people are saying, hey, back to the face issue, I don't want to lose face. If you give me this particular job, I want to do it well, and beyond and above what I need to do, I will go the extra mile to do it, right? So that can also cut both ways. But that's where the positives of the benefit of the friendship actually lie. But adding on to Lian Sim's point is about the process. Okay, so I think yes, if there is a potential conflict and then you flag out that I know this person very well and so on and so forth, then you must have a rigorous process, because I think we're not just going to exclude somebody because we're not saying that we exclude you because you know this person well, but there has to be a process to look at criteria, right, track record, right, comparing apples to apples in terms of the services, right, looking at references, getting even references from people who have done similar things. Is this person, this team, this particular project coordinator a good one, right, before we make that overall judgment? And it sometimes becomes even harder when you have limited supply, right, because Singapore is small, right, so you may not have 20, 30 vendors, offering this kind of service. Yes, for generic services perhaps, but if it's more specialized, in terms of the area of healthcare or sports or whatnot, the pool becomes a lot smaller. And in such a scenario, right, it can also pose a concern or constraint. So that's where the evaluation process does come in very, very importantly in this particular scenario.
All right, talking about scenarios then, obviously, if there is a perceived situation where there is a potential conflict of interest, I guess one of the questions is how can this be more effectively surfaced to the board? Whether it is a whistleblowing policy or whether it is some sort of other regime that's involved, how do you think, in the view of the panel, that potential conflicts of interest can be better and more effectively surfaced to the board? Maybe we'll bring Yuki in first.
Yeah, this is always difficult. I have still come back to the fact that Asian were slightly different as it is in that sense, because I think it is hard. You see, I really like Lian Sim's approach. I think this is something that I learned in this conversation. It's a process and a procedure. You see, if you have a clear process and a clear procedure, then it's no longer personal. Once it's no longer personal, things are very easy. Yeah. But herein lies the challenges with our culture. We are still developing our processes. Therefore, even in the midst of processes, right, if I execute the right process with you, you may never be my friend again too, because you will never talk to me again too, right? So I think we have to be circumspect about this. It's a process and procedure. Like one of the easiest thing, one of the simplest external mechanism will be whistleblowing. Right, but even that has its own challenges too, because I like to suggest that if you know the background of whistleblowing, it came from America because to reward people for whistleblowing on wastage government the project. In the West, it's hailed as a hero, no? But in the East, it's probably hailed as a betrayer too. No? So immediately culturally, we becomes problematic as it is. And unfortunately, in whistleblowing policy externally, I find challenging to execute that, because the employees or the person blowing the whistles must be very certain that there will be no retributions, right? That alone becomes an issue. So I found that in charities, generally the pain has always been, you probably need elder statesmen, or you need senior people who can police the process and procedure and talk to the person and say, yeah, I think this is a conflict of interest. Is that you put all of us in a difficult shoe, can you back off? I mean, like, or we can choose to throw the book at the person if they are courageous. Right? I see this. I think we should. I think we should. But the question lies in how many of us or the staff or board members are willing to throw the book at the other person. They say, yeah, this is a conflict. You're barred from tendering, or your friends are barred from tendering this. Yada, yada, yada.
Okay, Dennis, what are your thoughts? And still on that same issue, raising to the board's attention any conflicts of interest?
My view is that I think as boards mature, because we're talking about the board culture, that also needs time to change. But as boards mature and they start to talk about conflict of interest scenario more openly, right? Then it becomes a common topic. There's something that you cannot run away from, right? And it becomes a regular agenda. It's a question of how often do you address that regular agenda, right? In the old days, maybe not so much, but these days, I think when we talk about directors' education, right? When we talk about, training and knowledge sharing, right? And also, I think the best practices and the disclosure based on the CG code, right? This thing inevitably comes up, right? So the question is, how do you then ease that through the interaction process with the board and interaction process with the management? And the other thing we have to consider is when such a thing arises, right? What is the tone that we take? Like how I like what Prof said, right? It becomes, because if I raise the whistle or blow the whistle, it becomes a negative situation or something that, there's tension. How do you then escalate it up, right? Because we're talking not only the board, maybe there needs to be a subcommittee that deals with a lot of this. Again, of course, really depending on the size of the charities. Some charities are not about to trigger conflict of interest because the nature of the charity doesn't really involve that too much of such scenarios, right? Or some charities may be very large and they deal with many external parties and there are many scenarios of conflict. So they may call to question this subcommittee to actually review a conflict, right? So it can be a subcommittee, it can be a governance committee, it can even be an audit committee that looks at, the conflict scenario and, passes some sort of views on it. So there must be an escalation process and clarity on that.
Okay, I'll bring, Jensen, please.
Yes, within just the existing structures, there are certain people whose roles require them to be the person with that difficult job of being diplomatic and tackling that difficult subject. One of them is indeed the audit committee chairman. If you don't have anyone you feel you know very well to raise it with, the audit committee chairman is one whose role often is to do with risks, and this is a risk to the charity. That's the right person to approach. Maybe not the whole committee, but have a word with the chairman. Or the nominating committee chairman, if you have one, because the nominating committee chairman tends to look at the people on the board, or the chairman himself or herself. The chair might be the person. So selecting the person might help easily. And if you're one of the staff rather than one of the board members, just leave it to your CEO or your executive director. Tough, but they're there for that purpose and they'll have to do something about it.
Indeed, but I'm going to challenge that a little bit and put you in a difficult spot with my next question.
Okay.
And this is being said respectfully and not casting any aspersions on anyone for that matter. But it is also common knowledge that people serve on charity boards. Some of them know each other, that they could be friends, they could be buddies or things like that. But at the same time, would that in itself be an issue when you're trying to go to what you suggested, Lian Sim, the audit committee chairman, who may be related in some way as a friend of the entire chair of the entire board, I should say. That in itself would create some issues there. Is there a way in which this can be better managed?
Well, I was thinking about this issue of friendship in preparing for this session because, as always, one wants to really do one's best, especially for charities. And I thought, well, do I expect my friend to put herself or himself on the line and risk their personal reputation to give me maybe an unfair leg up, what kind of friend am I? And so I think that when we're talking about friendship, we need to look deeper into that relationship. If it's an acquaintance, maybe you don't know well enough, but you must, in your role, you were chosen for it because you are seen to have the ability to fulfill the role. So you will just have to find it within yourself to diplomatically and in the right way raise the issue. And as far as possible, therefore, to raise the issue early and the facts of the issue, as it were. And so I think we are all reminded that it's good to have a process. When you don't need it, put it in place so that everyone is aware. And the more people who are aware, then we are all eyes and ears for each other, and we can remind each other. And we don't have to wait for things to get to a situation until you have to use like a whistle-blowing route. But that too is an alternative. It is there, often for managed within the executive rather than for the board. But still, it is there, and the more safe and secure and reassuring you can make it, the more likely people are to use it.
Okay, I'm just wondering whether Yuki or Dennis would like to just weigh in with a point of view, and I'm going to try and feed another question in.
I mean, my thoughts with that one also echoes with what Lian Sim say. In fact, actually, the evaluation of why somebody is on the board has to be very robust, right? You have a nominating committee, right? You're bringing somebody on board, certainly not because friends. I mean, of course, there's a logic to being friends, because if you are passionate about the same cause, right, and you're more likely to get along together because you're passionate about the same thing, right, and therefore it's easier to make friendship. That is a common sense way of thinking about it. But the reality is, why is this person on the board, right? Is this person on the board because they have a certain skill sets? Today we are looking at skill sets, right? We are looking at expertise, right? Technical skill sets. Especially with digitalization and all that I mentioned earlier, it's good to have somebody who knows what they're talking about in terms of, how to transform. The second thing is also about, the experience, right? And of course, you need to know that this person is experienced either in the context of a non-profit or the context of that sector which a non-profit is actually operating in. So that part has to be very robust and very clear, right? And it's always good, to have the nominating committee review their processes, right? Review, how do they bring people on board, and how do we evaluate, the contributions that these people bring, right? I think that is also one of a good measure to assess whether or not, there will be, this conflict of interest thing can be swept under the carpet, or is it, just fully brought to light. Okay.
Okay, Prof.
So a quick word will be, it's true that the birds of a feather flock together. In that sense, I think lights get light, better lights. I think our challenge is for the smaller charities. I think many of the smaller charities struggles with just finding one good person, and one good person bringing another good person in, you see. So I think we have to start somewhere. So the good news, especially for smaller charities and charities at large as it is, I think the world, because of social media, because of openness and our young people, I think many people are willing to step forward, right, to do a good work. I think we need to just tap them. And like what I say, the professional bodies, the law society, the accounting society, all of them, I think, has to put in a lot more of their professionals to make them available in these sectors. They are good people. Let them start somewhere, and let the good birds of the good feather flock together.
Okay. Well, one of the very common things that transpires in the board whenever there's a conflict of interest is about trying to declare that you do have that COI. So it's whether a case of board directors declaring their interest in certain companies, or indeed that they know certain people, and then they don't take part in certain discussions. So this is a question coming from Jerome, and I'll try to sort of finesse that question a little bit. It's more about declaration of conflicts of interest. It is needed, as I just said, but does it mean that once a person, director or otherwise, declares that conflict of interest, that this person, this individual, is now free of that interest, of that conflicted interest, as it were? What are your thoughts? Maybe I'll bring Dennis in first.
Thank you, Melvin. Okay, I think the declaration is one part, but as I mentioned earlier, it's the actual or perceived or potential conflict, right? So it may not even be a conflict, but the escalation process to bring it up and talk about it, right? And then we will then decide whether or not it is a conflict or it's not a conflict. And then what do you do when it is, and what should you do when it's not? Now, many charities may choose to take the prudent approach, which is, there could be, I'm not sure, we don't know what will happen, right? But let's be safe. Right, it could be very much that is the route that is taken, right? But really, we need to have that process to bring it, to bring such a situation up, right? To discuss, whether there's a potential conflict, and even when that is escalated or discussed, right? That doesn't mean that you get a Hail Mary and then you can participate. Yeah, so I think it really depends on the outcome of that rigorous discussion and deliberation process, right? And the deliberation process also has to involve people who can objectively stand and say, okay, it is, right? So if the deliberation committee is all, for friends and friends of friends and so forth, then of course, then that adds a little bit of a color line, to whether or not the outcome will be what it should objectively be. Okay.
Okay, what's your view, Lian Sim?
Well, we've all heard about board diversity, haven't we? So, and really, these days, that is getting more attention because the environment is changing, and so one wants to be confident that the board, which is the sort of topmost body in the organization, is suitable to make the decisions going forward. So I think taking that sort of broader view of things, one should try and compose one's board for both today's decisions and the ones that we can see coming already in the near distance, So one understands, that sort of to temper. Maybe today you have more of the friendship factor and the support and the fellow feeling and enthusiasm might be very important. Maybe tomorrow, looking for tomorrow, when you look at the board's ability to take the decisions, you may want to, that may not be as important. And then you look for other things as well, so that you'll have that ability to make those decisions as a group. Even if one person has to recuse himself or something, then you're still functioning well, which is the outcome we would like.
Okay, well, there is a particular scenario here, which is coming from, I'm try the name here. No, sorry, I've just lost that. But the issue is really about, having a couple of directors in an organization. So if there's a charity with only 2 directors, and then you've got one of them being conflicted in a certain manner, whatever that is, how would that situation be addressed, given that now you're basically stuck with one person now? So, Dennis, you want to come in on this? Sorry, Yuki, go ahead.
Let me come back to Dennis and Lian Sim's earlier response. Right, I'm going to step on the shoulders of Jaya. I think Dennis is given a process and a procedure. Right, I think conflict interest. There are 3 things that's most important. The people need to know and understand what is a conflict. Right, that's the knowledge part. The second part is the declaration part, and the third part is the abstinent part. I call it the ADA. I say, you need to acknowledge, you need to declare, and then you need to abstain as it is, right? I remember in preparing for this, I was discussing with my wife. I thought I want to use a certain form of disease. My wife said too crude, so let me use just like COVID-19 as it is. You see, in order to fight that, we know if conflict of interest is like COVID-19, we need to be very clear to know what it is. All right. Once we think that we have it, what do? We have to declare. And then after that, what's the third thing we do? You quarantine. Yes, and so you think of COVID-19 as a substantial disease that will kill the organization. Then your approach becomes very simple. You need to know what is this disease. After that, you need to say, I think I have it or I have it. Then what do? You quarantine yourself. So in your 2 directors case, I think it's the same thought pattern. If assume both directors and anyone on the board always have the best interest of the charity, then they know that they know that conflict of interest is like it's a deadly disease that can kill the organization. Then if I'm in the best interest of the organization, I will take those other steps. I acknowledge it, right? I declare it, and then I abstain from it. That would be my approach.
Okay, Dennis?
Okay, I think the question also was about when you have two and then one is out, then what happens with the remaining one? Now, I mean, obviously, you then have to go back to the framework, decision-making framework, and authorization framework. Is one sufficient to make a sign off on it, or is that one person's decision based on a study or an evaluation done by a supporting cast, which is be the management team, right? So really, will that be sufficient, or in another situation, you may say that one remaining person, poor fella or lady, right, don't know how to make the decision because not an expert in this particular field, all right, or not exposed, right? But the question is then, okay, then you may need to take external help, right? How do you take an external help, right? Is it consultative, right? Or it may be, through an expert that comes in and look at it, right, and give a view or give an assessment, and then there's a basis that supports the decision. And also there's the other part, the disclosure part, members of the non-profit, right? So when you want to do something that is, I'm assuming is big enough, and I'm assuming is serious enough, right? To warrant that calling of all the members to say that, hey, this is what we are doing, this is why, and there's some transparency to the process, and it's all out there for everybody to agree or disagree, right? And then we talk through where the uncomfortable disagreements are, and we resolve it. So I think left with one person in the scenario calls it left with one person is not exactly the end of the world, right? There are ways around it.
Okay, Lian Sim, did you want to offer a point of view here? If not, I'll move to a question. No? So, okay. So I guess in the business world, as all of you have been plugged into, there is a lot of talk about related parties and related party transactions. And I think in some of the recent news articles, we've also been hearing a lot about this. So we do have a question here between Esther and Nordiana, and I'll try to put the two together. It's really about directors and employees of related companies. How would you handle any potential conflicts of interest here? And also, I guess, if a chairman of a charity is also sitting in the board of directors of a subsidiary that's owned by the same charity, then are there issues here? Can the chairman in question be appointed as a trustee, for example? Anybody would like to offer a thought? Prof.
Okay, all right. You see, to me, the law is very clear, right? There's a Companies Act that talks about the fiduciary responsibility of a director. Who do you own that fiduciary responsibility to, right? I believe in the charity sector too, in the sense that you cannot have two charities in which they do not consolidate into one when their board overlaps more than 50%. You can't, as it is. Then you'll be deemed as a group, as it is, for that matter. Is that what I mean? So I think the existing laws allows us to deal with some of these tricky issues. Of course, it is always well said when they frame the American Securities Act, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. That means bring it to the public, bring it to openness as it is. That will take care of some of the issues. You see, don't forget too, in today's world, it is very difficult to hide. The social media alone, if they pound on actual facts in terms of conflict of interest and people gaining from that conflict of interest or make terrible decisions based on that conflict of interest, right? Your reputation get ruined too, you see. So in that sense, the world create different mechanism in a very complicated world, right, to deal with some of these issues. And my constant comment has always been, in the complicated world today with social media, right, we just have to be very careful because our things will fire us out. You see, I mean, in due time. It may not be now when we're in power, but one day when we step down, you see, I mean, right, the things are uncovered, and then you'll be miserable life, very miserable, because all our entire life and reputations will be ruined because of that. I'm sorry, it sounds a bit negative, but I think as trustees, as directors, we really owe a significant responsibility to do well with it, right?
Okay, Lian Sim, what are your thoughts?
I'm not, I don't feel qualified to comment on this trustees, but I would say that it depends on, I mean, the objective, as both, as UK has said, is to have good decisions for the charity and for the beneficiaries. Can that be carried out under that structure with the same chairman? If it's similar enough, and they must have reasons for wanting to have it into two entities, so there must be some differences. If it's purely a difference of location and convenience, that's one. Then you could say it's very similar, it's practically the same thing. But if it's not, and there are differences, then I would examine the business, as it were, of each of those entities before coming to a decision. And I think one can, it's not to say that good decision cannot be made, but you want to limit a situation where a good decision is not so likely to be made. That's why you change the structure. So it's not something that cannot be done, but you would then examine, is it really a good thing to be done? Is that the best for both entities? And then examine it. I would mull on it, and I would consider what sort of direction each is going to take, and then come to a decision. It's not, it doesn't have to be chop chop done today.
Indeed. Dennis, come in. I know in your professional role, of course, you deal with a lot of different parties, and I'm sure this whole related party thing comes into the mix.
Correct. I think the related party part is one part, because you talk about the knowledge that who is related to who. Then of course you bring in the concept of the corporate veil, right? You cannot be hiding behind a corporate veil and say that, oh, I hold a responsibility, but yet I do not know what is the implication of me discharging my responsibility. So the corporate veil cannot be used as an excuse. But I think the question is then, when you put somebody in that position of responsibility and authority, like a trustee, for example, right, or a chairman of a particular, committee, as something big enough and serious enough, do you have the right person? Right? Is this person the most suited person for the job? Right? Because he or she may be making decisions that, well and good if it is good for the best interest of the company and organization, right? But the day comes when something is difficult to decide and deliberate on, and there's no result, and there's no clear direction where to go. In taking one line, he may be, creating a conflict with somebody else. In creating another line, he may be going down the beaten road where he doesn't know what he's doing, right? So I think putting that person, the right person in the right job, is in the right role, if I may, is the most important part now. Will that person then be able to consider the factors, stand on his own understanding, competency, right, as well as position within the group to say that this is the right thing to do? You don't put anybody as a treasurer, because that person has signatory powers, right? And you cannot put somebody who is very junior as a treasurer. It's somebody that must has not only the visibility and understanding of the mechanics of, you use the case study of the $350,000 that was spent, or somebody who's able to ask the right questions and get access to the right information to interpret whether or not I'm doing this thing for the right and the good of the organization.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. We probably have about 4 to 5 minutes left of this session. I just want to bring in the last question, I guess, if we have time for. Really an operational question. Is probably the top one that's got 10 votes at this point. It's a scenario. So the charity's financial year is from April to March, which is a typical March year end. In terms of the conflicts of interest declaration, which should be done annually, should the staff do this in January or April? What are the thoughts? Maybe Dennis, you come in on this first.
I think that the general principles which I would advise is, it's good when you have new members to committees, bring them on board, get them to declare. So that can happen anytime within the year, right? It's usually upon the appointment or reappointment process. Of course, for the staff, then we make it a regular process every year, right? Whether that year may be the beginning or the middle of the year, but so long as it's a 1-year cycle that stretches across 12 months, I think that would be a good 12 months would be a good gauge. The other part is when there are transactions, right? Because people can actually, the conflict position may change, right? And you cannot expect the secretary to keep doing his investigations and due diligence and follow up on whether or not you are conflicted in this and that, right? Those situations change very dynamically. So it's a question of when there is a transaction or a particular event, then a conflict check should be done,
right? And so I think there are three parts to this, if I may answer.
Yep. So in other words, declare and declare promptly and declare whenever there's a reason to
Timely.
do so. Yeah,
Yes.
in a timely
Correct.
manner. Okay, I'm just going to end off with one quick thought from each of you as a parting shot. If you were to look at this whole thing about managing conflicts of interest, what would be the one key takeaway that you'd like our audience today, 400 of them who are listening at this point, to take away with them? We'll start with Yuki first.
Yes. Personally, for my takeaway, I must say honestly, I really learned a lot from Lian Xin and Dennis, particularly concerning procedures. Right. I've been in this space for a long time, but I think today's session actually reminded me, if you have proper procedure and processes, you take away the personality and the personal quarrel away from the system, particularly for conflict of interest. So I deeply appreciate it and learned a lot. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, so hard to fault the process if it's well established. Lian Sim.
I think it's the practice of it, and that if we should, as we proceed day to day, think about, are there conflicts? We should be aware, and we should know where we have procedures. Sorry, Prof. We should have procedures, escalation procedures, or how it could be handled, so that we're not taken by surprise, and that we will be handled in our stride as we go ahead.
Thank you, Lian Sim. Dennis, last word.
I think you use the what if scenario, right? So what if something went very, very wrong, right? And this ended up in the public eyes and domain, right? And then use that as a so-called barometer to assess whether or not you need to dig deeper, do more checking, check with more people, get more views, right? And then with that worst case scenario, then it will guide you, right, towards your best case scenario, right?
Okay, so the best case scenario is not always the best case, because we are reaching the end of the clock with this session. So the scenario is I do need to end this discussion. And I wanted to thank Lian Sim, Yuki, and Dennis for sharing their robust views in this particular session. And I'm sure all of you would have taken away something interesting